Hello. I assume that many of us as parents are frustrated when we are trying to get people to change, right? And that's one of the important messages that we're going to be talking about today. Um, but first, I need to say that I'm feeling incredibly sad and heartbroken, not only because of the war in the Ukraine today, but the continual abuse that our children are experiencing in schools. So, today we're going to talk about questions that need to be asked at the IEP meeting, with conversations with our neighbors, conversations at our dinner table. And today we're going to talk about what matters most. Not how can we do this the easy way, not how can we find the lowest price for change, and not that we pretend we care. So, what I'm sharing with you today comes from Peter Block's book, The Answer to How is Yes, Acting on What Matters. And as I said in my email, I am not an expert on this. I am trying to learn right with you. So, this is, I feel a little more vulnerable because it's like, am I going to present Peter Block's thoughts and suggestions in an accurate, valid way? But I think the conversation we need to have is what the important thing is. And that is looking at that bottom line of what matters most. So, we are going to be having a lively discussion. I hope that you will share some examples, you will share some questions and thoughts that you have, because that's how we have rich conversations, and that's how we make rich, sustainable change, by working together and creating something new together. So, welcome. If you don't know me, if we haven't met, I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a retired teacher. I'm a parent of a son who receives special ed inclusive services from preschool through college. And I'm a full-time advocate, helping support parents like you that are advocating for that inclusive education for their child. So, as we go through today's topic of questions, please know that I'll be putting together a summary of today's show. And if you would like to get that and you aren't currently receiving my email, just let me know. So, we are going to share my screen and get started with our day today, right? So, that frustration is real. Getting bogged down, getting depleted with our own energy is real. And our hope is that we can find ways to change this. So, let us look here. What we're going to be looking at today is some of the questions that we typically hear a lot at IEP meetings. So we may hear, how do we get the teachers to support inclusion? How do we get training for the staff? How can we make sure our children are really learning? Now, if you look at each one of those questions, look at the first word. How? 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 And what we learned from Peter Block is we often ask those how questions sooner than later. And when we make that mistake of asking how questions too soon, these are some of the unintended consequences. We are really giving into our doubts. We doubt that change can happen. We doubt that our children will really be learning. And in that doubt, we seek out those how answers to those how questions, thinking that that is going to be the answer we're looking for. Peter Block also tells us that when we ask those how questions too soon, that we're really settling for what we know how to do or we can learn quickly. And that is that answer that we're going to grab onto. If it's something we already know, if it's something we can learn quickly. And that really doesn't help us as we're going through this change process. When we ask how too soon, we're overvaluing what is practicable and doable instead of what matters. So as we're going through today, if you're watching live or in the replay, please add your comments and questions. It's important that your voice be in this discussion because this isn't just about me. This is about all of us and how we're all trying to do better, right? So let's continue on. This is the book, Peter Block, The Answer to How is Yes, Acting on What Matters. And we will be using his ideas and his thoughts today in our show. One of the things that he says is one way of understanding the meaning of the question how is to consider it as an expression of our wish for control and predictability. This is the appeal of the question. So I think that's so interesting in if we look at really the basis of so many of our how questions, it's to meet our need of control and something that's going to be predictable. So we are going to look at 6 different how questions that are often asked and what we can replace those how questions with. So let's go. We're going to be questioning the questions today. Question 1 that we often hear is, how do we do it? When we ask this, Peter Block says we're in a position of not having the information and believing others have the knowledge that we need. So how do we advocate for inclusion? We probably have a lot of answers to that question, and we know many things that we can do. But when we ask how, we are discounting our knowledge and our skills and trying to say maybe somebody else has the right answer. And it's also interesting how Peter Block says this how question of how do we do it really is more of an expression of our doubt than our curiosity. And I think that's really true. I mean, today we're looking at this in terms of IEP meetings and advocating for our children and as teachers advocating for our students. And sometimes I think we're led to believe that when the district asks us, how can we do inclusion? How can we include your child? That we interpret that as finally they're asking questions. They want to do this. They want to know how to do this. And really, it's more of a reflection of those underlying doubts. Like, I don't know how in the world our district is going to do this. And it's not that how do we do it is a question that we never want to ask, but it's a question that we don't want to ask too soon. So, what can we ask instead? Well, first of all, Peter Block talks about asking how can prevent us from asking a more important question if what we want to do is worth doing. So sometimes we get so caught up in the logistics of, the details and the tasks that we have to do, and we don't have that big picture of, is what we're doing really worth it? And that's something that we have to ask ourselves. Is this something that you really want to do? How committed are you to this outcome? So instead of asking, how do we do it? Peter Block challenges us to say, what refusal have I been postponing? Now, this is like so intriguing for me, because it's like, I've never thought of it in those terms. What refusal have I been postponing? What do I know I'm going to have to say no to in order to get to what matters most? So instead of coming from a question of what method, what strategy, what, technology should we use, we can look at the full array of choices that we have. And we also need to come to grips with that question of, have we decided what we do not want to recreate? Often we hear people talking about, well, it's like these silos that we have in our education system, with the special education silo, the general education silo, the gifted and talented silo, and that we have in many ways said, no, we don't want all these individual silos. We want an education system that works for all the diverse students that we have. For every student that walks through that door, that's what we want. We want to know and consider our kids as general education students first. So that's something that we hear a lot of parents talking about. However, do our actions align to that? Because when we look at all the IEP meetings we're going to and all the different things that we're trying to change in our district, one of the ideas that parents come up with is, how do I create a special education advisory committee? And how can we, have dialogue with administrators and with staff? And how can the special ed parents, PTO, provide workshops and do things for families? And how often do we say, is what we're talking about and is what we're asking for, this special education advisory committee, isn't that perpetuating those silos? doesn't that perpetuate the silo of special education? Is something different and over here versus the typical PTA that is working on other issues? And I've talked about this before, how we need to look at, if we want a unified education system, then are these separate organizations that we continue to create, are they really being helpful? So I want to pause here and get some of your thoughts. Lisa is here. Hey, Lisa. She says, can't that be informed by past experience? I can't say how many times I was told something would happen with no specifics that never came to pass. And she also says, isn't how just a natural part of accountability? And yes, and it's interesting because Peter Block does talk in his book about accountability. And I think and this is my thinking, Lisa. So, I mean, this is not the gospel truth. This is Charmaine Tanner trying to figure things out. It's okay to have those how questions and to expect accountability. But when we ask them too soon, we shut down all the other possibilities and we look at just the models that exist or how somebody else did it or, what somebody else suggests. And we don't really look at, for our community, for our situation, for our kids, for this child we're talking about at the IEP meeting, is this going to matter to them and to their life? And we look at that first before we go into those how questions where we want that predictability and those answers. Hey, Jennifer. Jennifer is a trailblazer from Texas, and she says, we're in the process of forming an advisory group in our district, but I do have some of the qualms about separate PTAs and such as you do. Yeah, and there's opportunities, and I think it can be helpful for parents to, choose to be together and to share things and to, brainstorm. I just think when we keep doing it as a separate organization and the school sees this only as this special interest group, that really hinders the change in what matters most and what we're trying to achieve. So yeah, it's, and like I said, if we're trying to dismantle silos and on the same hand, we're creating these separate parent groups, like, to me, the separate parent groups perpetuate we're in a different silo. And like I said, these are my thoughts. So take them with a grain of salt, and people need to decide, for their community, what is going to be best and what matters most for their community, right? Lisa says, I agree about all the special, separate, extra groups. I long for disability to become an automatic consideration in all decision, not just for the designation SPED people. Yeah, and that's, and it's, and it's beyond special education, right? Because there are other diverse learners in our schools that aren't receiving the support and the services that they need to be successful. So again, when we're just this special ed silo, then that means, does everybody else have to have their separate silos? And how do we really impact change on a level that's going to be sustained and on a level that recognizes all of our kids are diverse learners? It's not a label that you get that makes you a diverse learner. You're a diverse learner because you're a human, right? And that's That's what matters most. That's the bottom line that we need to be looking at and speaking up about. Um, but I appreciate your comments. So thank you for being here. Jennifer says, I've been very clear with the administration that we have to stop making special ed department this separate entity. Yeah. And that, yeah, I mean, you look at the structure of our district, right? Um, we often have, an assistant superintendent of curriculum and instruction. And then we, in a separate, organization chart, we have the director of special education. And it's like, so why is that different than curriculum and instruction? Why can't we merge those? Um, Look at colleges that prepare teachers, that have teacher education programs and that have a elementary education program at the college, a secondary education program at the college, and a special education program and department at the college. So right as teachers are learning how to be teachers, they experience those silos too in higher education. So I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm a depressing person. Um, but I do see good things happening and I do see progress. And I know some students, like Jennifer's son, Wade, is like breaking ground and being a member of the marching band. There are good things happening. And there are things that are happening based on what matters most to that community. And that's the conversation we need to be having, not just with ourselves as parents, not with parents and teachers, but with our community. We have to be looking at what matters most for our education system. And that's where all those conversations need to, I think, be leading from. That needs to be the basis of why we come together, because we want to figure out what matters most and we want to create that together. Jennifer also says, funny story. We need funny stories. When we filed due process, the director of elementary education asked me why we didn't go through him first. Well, the district has never mixed the two, but it happened that he's the one who solved it for us, not special ed. Isn't that cool? That's a great story, Jennifer. Yeah, it's like, the labels that we have on kids can be something that is, leads to this self-fulfilling prophecy. When our kids claim their own disability label, that comes from a sense of pride, right? And when we look at how can we resolve things, maybe we need to look outside of that organizational chart that says this director does this and this assistant superintendent does this. But we bring our questions, we bring our concerns to a larger administrative audience within the school district, at school board meetings, things like that, right? But we've got to be thinking of what matters most. How can we create change together? So let's go on. So Barb, hey Barb, she is a trailblazer in Texas too. She says, your thinking is right on, Charmaine. I've been an inclusion advocate facilitator since 1987, and the separations you're describing are exactly what happens and keeps inclusion and accommodating learning differences from being implemented as best practice. I've seen that over and over again. Yeah. So we we know this is a concern. And so hopefully today, as we get some more examples from Peter Block's thinking of what other kinds of questions can we ask. So let's go back here and we're going to look at, so this is something that I don't know, it like came into my head today. I was thinking of so many times it feels like we're being strung along by the district, right? And they give us these little crumbs and expect us to be grateful. So we want to stop that stringing along kind of philosophy of how things go in your district. The second question that we ask too soon is how long will it take? And we know as a culture we're into fast food, ordering online, going and picking things up, and just having almost immediate kinds of results. And that's part of the culture that we have to look at, because when we're looking at creating big change, it's not going to be a instant order this from Amazon and we get the change package for our district the next day. That isn't going to happen. And when we look at how long will this take, so many times we're looking at change or improvement has to happen fast. And I get it that our kids can't waste another school day. And unfortunately, there aren't any really fast answers. The caution is when we go too fast, sometimes we oversimplify things and we really don't look at the structures and the supports that we want to make sure are there for our kids. If we only want to choose strategies that can be implemented quickly, we're not going to have sustained change in our districts, right? So instead of asking, how long will it take? Here's a question we can ask ourselves. What commitment am I willing to make? We have to ask what is important. Oops. Because change comes from taking the time to do things properly. And I know it can be really frustrating to think as parents, it's like, what? They're expecting me to, have my kid wait years before this change happens. And I get it. I mean, I wasn't willing to wait years for things to happen for Dylan. And that's why when he was 3, we filed due process for the least restrictive environment, because it's like, no, we are not willing for you guys to figure this out. He is 3 years old. He is going to a community preschool. So there are times when we can't just wait, right? We have to have something change for our children now. And that commitment is something that can be really, triggering, right? To keep being told we have to wait. So when we look at ourselves and our commitment to making change, what we want to ask ourselves too is, are we all in? And I would say, as parents and educators, that if you're watching this live or on the replay, you have been all in. And the other part that comes with being all in is when we have to take a break and when we need to rest and to give ourselves permission. Because the emotional toll of being all in every day, 24/7, can be really damaging to ourselves and to our family. So yes, we have this commitment, but also give yourself permission to take a break, to rest, to get your breath back, and then to continue on. We need to take our time. We need to think things through. And so this is the hard part, right? Because how do we take our time when every day counts so much for our kids? So what do you think? What do you think? How can we take time, and yet how can we make sure that change is going to happen and that it will be sustainable? So Kelly, hey Kelly, so she said, a friend shared an article about personalized learning. It's sort of like an IEP light for all kids, drawing some interesting parallels. Sounds ideal if done right, but hard to pull off. Does anybody know about this idea? And she lists the link for the article. So when I do my show notes and send those out to you guys, I'll include this. So Kelly, I've heard about similar things. I don't know if it's the same, exact thing that the article is talking about. But yeah, I mean, people have been saying for a number of years that it's not just disabled kids with IEPs that should be granted, this way of tapping into their interests, building on their strengths. And I think that, to me, is part of the principles and the framework of universal design for learning, that we would need less, all these individualized separate plans, if when we are first creating our materials for schools, when we're first creating our lesson plans, that we look at all the possible diverse learners that we could have in our classroom. And instead of trying to retrofit, we're proactive and we look at what are the different interests of the students in my class? How can I pull that in? How can I help them become engaged and more motivated? And so I'll be interested, Kelly, to read that article and see how that, I don't know if it aligns to universal design for learning. But I think you bring up an excellent point that it's every student we're talking about. We're not just talking about kids on IEPs. We're talking about everybody. So Jennifer says, if we applied this to all kids, imagine where we'd be. And our kids would no longer be seen as special. Yes, and we wouldn't be special needs parents, right? Kelly says, I'm kind of thinking that if you universalize it, yes, UDL, then it isn't a special system for some kids, but it's just how education is. And we start to break down those silos we keep struggling against. Yes, excellent. Thank you so much, Kelly. And I think that's exactly true, right? And that's why, to me, when we have these separate parent organizations, we're not even talking to other parents, and other parents, they have, questions and worries about how their child is, making progress in school. And so it's a universal need for parents to make sure their kids are loved and safe and that they're happy, right? And that they're learning. So that universal need that we have for parents, that's what we can use as, this is what brings us together. This is not what separates us. This is what brings us together. And Lissa's here. Hey, Lissa is a trailblazer in Idaho. And she said, I've always had a really difficult time waiting. If something is not right, I tend to hound and be all in and drive the people that I want the change for being, and feeling like you're labeled as that crazy parent or that parent that can't ever be satisfied. And I know, and I struggle with that too, because it's like, well, my kid can't wait years, right? I mean, it's like, so that's still a big struggle for me to say we're not going to do something quick and easy, but we are going to look at how we can create change for everyone, right? Um, so keep your questions and comments coming. I appreciate you guys. So let's look at our third question, which gets asked a lot, and sometimes not directly in school meetings, because schools aren't supposed to talk about how much things cost. But the question is, how much does it cost? And again, at some point in the change, continuum, or the change process is probably a better word. Yeah, you know, we're going to probably have to look at some cost and some budget. But if we ask that how question prematurely, it does a disservice for us. So, and if we look at, well, gee whiz, that reading program, well, that's expensive, and we conclude that this will be a problem, and it's not something that people will even entertain as an idea because of the cost. And when we look at the cost of things, it really sets barriers and parameters about what we value. And high cost options are usually taken off the table pretty quickly, even before they're considered. So instead of asking, how much does it cost? The question becomes, what's the price I'm willing to pay? And so a lot of what I've read in Peter Block's book really comes to that individual level and the questions that we have to ask ourselves. Because we know the true cost of change is not just financial, it's not just about dollars, but the cost of change can be very emotional, right? And that's what we need to always be aware of also. So Peter Block suggests that the key is to calculate our will, which is a personal measure of what we want rather than the economic measure. So if we want a school system that is going to be, accepting of all students, of, welcoming, of looking at, I don't know why I have a join Zoom coming up. If we want a school system that's going to be equitable, that's going to look at how we welcome students, how we presume that they're competent and expect that they'll be learning. If we want a school system that not only wants to welcome students, but wants to see every student as someone who has much to contribute to our lives. If we want that, then the cost is not as important right now as figuring out what are the ways, what are the, community members, the universities, where can we find other partners? because there are other people in other organizations besides the school system that would like to see our education system change too. So instead of being worried about cost at the beginning, let's look at how we can, um, create these allies and partnerships. And as we said before, there is a significant emotional cost to continue to be asking for change, um, and that's something we have to weigh as a family. There are times when we have to call a timeout, and I guess it's not a good word to use, have to call a break, because we do have to look at the impact this is having on ourselves and our family. So that's another consideration. But we hope that the district is also looking at, like, what are your values? Like, I read mission statements, from school districts or school buildings, or, the little signature line on the email from the special ed director. And it's like, yes, this is exactly what we agree with too. But where are those values, and how does the district show those values they're so proud of advertising? How do they show that every day with our kids? So Karen is here. We have all these trailblazers. Karen is from Colorado. So, hi, Karen. I'm glad you could be here. And you look at the different states that we have represented today, and the seeds that each of you are planting in your district and in your state. And this is going to be what we want to nurture, is these seeds of change that each of you are individually planting for your child, but in fact, it's going to help other children too. So let's hope, right? Let's ask the district, what are your values? How does this play out? How does this show up? It's not just a statement on your website. It's got to be walking the talk, right? Question number 4. I have to take a drink of water before I do this one. How do we get those people to change? And raise your hand if you've ever thought this, asked this, screamed this. It's like, how in the world can I get these school people to see things from the perspective that I have? How can we move them to change? And yes, this can be an important question, but like the other how questions, if we ask this too soon, it's not going to be helpful. And it would help if I got on the right monitor. We may say we want others to change for good reasons. No matter how we phrase the question, it is an attempt to dominate others. We establish ourselves as having greater knowledge than others when we ask this question. So, this is something that really stood out for me in Peter Block's book about, wow, when I'm frustrated, when I'm trying to see how come we can't get people to change what they're doing, am I coming from a place of I have the answers. I've done the research. I've talked to other parents. I know what it's like as being a teacher. And I have the answer. And is that a thought that precludes us from making change? So I don't know. It's pretty big. It's pretty massive, right? So instead of saying, how do we get those people to change? Look at this. What is my contribution to the problem I'm concerned with? And wow, when I read this, it was like, yikes, Charmaine, take a look at yourself. What am I saying? What am I doing? What is my body language saying? How am I contributing to the problem? And it's like, at first, it's like, what? I'm not contributing to the problem. I'm trying to change the problem. But you know what Gandhi said? And it's important for us to remember, right? We must be the change we want to see in the world. So, how open am I to hearing other people's thoughts? Or am I just sitting there waiting for them to stop talking so I can jump in and I can share research and I can talk about change? And so, how can I be the change that I want to see in the world? How can I decondition myself from the ableism that I saw, that I knew, that I have said, that I continue to have, those ableist beliefs? That's not helping, right? So I have a personal responsibility of what I need to do. It's not all about if those silly school people would just wake up and figure this out. It's like, what do I have to change? Pretty big questions, right? So keep your thoughts and comments coming. We're going to look at some more of them right now. So Janice, thanks. As a special ed teacher, I get overwhelmed because of parents, and I know what the child needs. And the district says they agree, but don't fund or support. Thank you, Janice, for being here. Yeah, and one of the things that I'm guilty of is doing so much generalization about the teachers that don't want to change. And yet we have millions of teachers like Janice that also are speaking up and wanting to get the appropriate supports and services for their children, right? For their students that they serve. And how do we connect with those teachers versus fighting against them? How do we say, you know what? We have shared values. We want to work together. We realize how much more we can create when we're working together. So it's so much, right? Susan, hey, Susan, she said, to be honest, they don't give us much time for meetings. So there's an urgency to share the vision for inclusion. Yes. And that's the thing, it's like, our IEP meetings are just, so many times it seems like the IEP meetings are there to, get this form filled out, go on the computer, get that drop down menu going and select some things and put them in boxes. And, that's our goal. That's what we're supposed to do at IEP meetings. And it's so frustrating because it's like we don't have any time to share ideas. And so I don't know if, I know some parents will have like pre IEP meetings with the staff and try to do some of that brainstorming ahead of time. But that is something that I think is so missing from the structure that most schools have for IEP meetings. It's like get the invitation out, set the date, have the parent come, maybe give the parent a draft IEP beforehand, but just kind of expect that we're here, it's a business meeting, we're here to fill out this form, and we're on to the next family. And that's not helpful. So, if others on here have ideas about how have you engaged, how have you started conversations with school staff before you actually sit down or before you turn on Zoom for that virtual meeting, what kinds of discussions, what kinds of conversations do you have? And sometimes that can be back and forth through email, which, isn't the best. But what are some ideas that you've tried that have been successful for how do we get these conversations happening before we start filling out any box on that IEP form? So let us know if you have some ideas, because that's really critical, right? So we need to make sure that that becomes part of what we are doing. So we are going to be the change that we want to see in the world. We have 2 more questions, and the 5th question is, how do we measure it? Now, if you know me, you might. I've had some facilitators at IEP meetings that know me well, and one of the things that they kind of, I think I've kind of got this reputation of being the queen of data, or Charmaine's going to ask for data, be prepared. And as an advocate, I have put a lot of emphasis on how do we measure this? And what Peter Block says is so interesting. So let's look here. He talks about, I just would like my cursor to go in many places at once. He says our preoccupation with measurement is really an indication of our distrust. And I thought, yep, he hit the nail on the head there for me. I don't trust often that things that are supposed to be happening aren't happening. And so one of the ways that I try to say, let's see some accountability, is ask, how do we measure it? Show us how you measured it. Show us your data collection. Show us your raw samples. Show us your work samples. We want to see what the child is actually doing. And in fact, asking how we're going to measure something puts pressure on us where we only want to work with what's predictable and manageable. And the unintended consequence of this is that we're leaving invention and creativity out of the picture. Because sometimes what matters most is going to be really hard to measure. We talk about measuring our child's progress and getting progress reports. And, is the progress report very helpful or not? But then we look at what really matters most for our kids. What do we want our kids? How do we want them to feel about school? How do we want them to feel about getting up and going to school? And some of those things that really matter aren't something that you can measure on a graph. So instead of asking, how do we measure? We ask ourselves, what measurement would have meaning to me? And this includes things like homeschool communication. I have parents that's like, do you have an example of a communication log? And it's like, you can go on Pinterest and find hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of communication logs. But you have to figure out for yourself as a parent what's important for you to know. What's a measurement that's going to be meaningful for you? Because that quantitative data we spend a lot of time collecting can measure progress, but it probably doesn't really measure what matters most. And I mean, that's evident when you look at our test-driven mentality that we have in our education system, right? And, we look at what we measure. And is that really the thing that we want to be measuring? So when we look at progress reports, when we ask for all that data, that can be important. But again, we don't want to ask for it too soon in the process. We want to be looking at how do we know, and not necessarily measure and quantitative data, but how do we know if kids have that sense of identity and are proud of that? How do we know if there's equity in our school buildings? We know there's diversity, right? How is that seen as a plus for our schools? How do we measure inclusion? We measure progress on IEP goals. How do we measure our child being included? And are they really having that sense of belonging? Are they really participating and actively making progress? I think these are what we're coming from, right? These are the values that we have. And yet it gets twisted, and somehow it's like when we measure IEP goals, and if we don't see enough progress in IEP goals, then we think, what's wrong here? And maybe we have to take a step back and say, are we measuring what counts? Do we ask students for their opinion? Do we get student input? As adults, we can't sit back and come up with these ideas for change when we haven't even had the students in the conversation. So how do we make sure that our kids' voices are counted at school? And let's take some more of your comments. So Susan says, I can get over here. I don't know. It's not coming up. I'll read it too. She says, we are going to have an IEP meeting this spring for the middle school transition. I called a meeting before the meeting and they said it had to be an IEP meeting. So I made the PowerPoint, conducted the meeting, and asked for their support in for inclusion in middle school. It was a pre-IEP meeting. Yeah, and that's what sometimes we need to do. And Amy Plicka from New York has created a really interesting, different way of looking at how we share our child with the school staff. So I'll put a link in our show notes for Amy's website, Universal Crossings. And one of the things that she is really, profoundly, ingrained in is how do we share who our child is and resources that we know would be helpful with staff. And she does that before the meeting. So having that pre-IEP meeting. And for some schools that say no, everything needs to be done in an IEP meeting, you can come back and say, it's helpful for us to have more time to discuss and clarify where each of us are coming from. And if there's any, decisions made at this pre-IEP meeting, we can bring those next week to the actual IEP meeting, and we can make sure that, we continue the discussion and we make decisions in the IEP meeting. But it doesn't preclude you from talking with people ahead of time, because all of that conversation is missing when we just have this business IEP meeting. And Mindy, Mindy says, I found that real conversation is hard to get to until it comes from top down, that there is a concern. Yeah, it's, and I think that's part of the problem, right? Is that, we're waiting for kind of our concerns to escalate to, maybe it gets to the superintendent level, or maybe it gets to the school board level. And we're looking for those people to say, yes, we need to change things here. And we know that school leadership really sets the tone for the culture in our schools, so that the administrators play a big part as a leader. And I think it's a combination of, yes, we need to make sure the school leadership has the values that we also share, but then also that grassroots. So it's, coming from the top down, but it's also coming from grassroots of parents, teachers, students, and then meeting and talking about, what change can we create now in our district. But yeah, the leadership is really important. Karen says, I wish we measured how they were implementing accommodations and supports instead of kids. Yeah. So that's the thing. It's like, if we have things like, yeah, we have this long list of accommodations and a list of supports, but how do we measure if those are really being implemented on a daily basis? And if they are they making a difference? I mean, so many times as an advocate, when I read IEPs, it's, the accommodation list is pretty much copied and pasted from the previous IEP. And it's like, no, there's probably some accommodations on here we figured out really don't work. And there's probably some new accommodations we've been using that aren't on this list. So yeah, making that a fresh discussion each time. And, I mean, there's different things. I remember a parent that would have like a Post-it note and she printed off like several, like a package of these that the school could have. And it had the accommodations on there for like written worksheets. And so the teacher could pull off that Post-it note, put it on the student's paper, and that would be a reminder for the teacher and a reminder for the student, like, these are the accommodations we're supposed to be providing you. I mentioned, and I don't know if it was in one of our Trailblazer meetings, there was a mom from Texas, and she had an excellent idea for secondary students where she printed off a page of her son's accommodations, put them in his notebook that he carried from class to class. And that was a way for him to be a self-advocate, to pull it out and say, well, actually, this is one of the accommodations that I'm supposed to be receiving. And so that was a step that her son could make to advocate. The other question, and I might be going down a rabbit hole here, but the other question that comes to mind is a lot of times, especially with high school students, and I've also seen it with middle school students, the teachers will say, well, they have to learn to ask for their accommodations. They're getting older now. And, when they get out of school, they're not going to have an IEP. They need to learn how to ask for things. And I totally agree. That's a skill we want our kids to have. But we can't say we're going to deny the accommodation until the child asks for it. It's like, no, the accommodation is there. And the student can decide, yes, this is a time when I need the accommodation, or no, I'm doing fine as it is. But it's not up to us as teachers to wait for students to ask for what they're supposed to be getting. And Abby is here from Kentucky, a Trailblazer. She says, seems really hard to get to true collaboration with the school. Yeah, and I think it's not just the school system, right? I mean, we can look at the health system and the medical system, and how much collaboration do we have with our doctors that are making decisions about our health? And so, yeah, that collaboration is hard, and it can be hard. It can be challenging. And that's the thing, right? It's like, what can we do together? And I don't know, maybe it's a step back, and instead of collaborating about inclusion or collaborating about universal design for learning, maybe we collaborate on, accessibility in the school building, or accessibility of the school newsletter that goes home. So maybe we look at other projects that might seem smaller and might seem like, oh, they don't matter as much. But all of that is helping us to, again, plant those seeds of these are some steps that we can take as a school community. And one, to be aware of, and two, how we can change that. And Abby goes on to say, measuring inclusion is definitely a priority, but the closest we have come to that as far as IEP goals is my daughter will start and maintain interactions with a peer for 8 minutes. I'm not sure that really measures inclusion. I know. And see, that's hard, right? When we get down to writing measurable goals. And as an advocate, I jump on that right away. It's like, oh, this goal isn't measurable. Look what we have to do now. And so then we go, okay, we want our kids interacting. We want them developing relationships and friendships. So how do we measure that? Well, we could set a timer and say, during the 10 minutes of free time, how many times does our child engage in a conversation or a back and forth, conversation with a peer? And it becomes like so sterile that it's like, yuck, is this really what we want to be looking at? And again, unfortunately, I don't have the answers. I have questions, And I like your thoughts and your questions. And it really is dependent on your community, your child. But yeah, it's hard. And Stacy, look at you, trailblazer from Washington. She said, Karen, yeah, so true. I agree. How do we measure the implementation of accommodations and supports? So there's a lot, right, that we need to continue doing. And there are changes that we're seeing. And so that's helpful. That's hopeful. Those are the things that we have to hang on to as parents and teachers. The last question that we're going to talk about is, how are other people doing it successfully? And this is another thing that I have asked that I'll bring up, and I'll say, if this can happen, if inclusion can happen in, Woodland Park, Colorado, it can happen in your community too. And then we look at, how are some of the other schools doing it? Look at the federal technical assistant grants that different groups are having. What models are they showing us? Again, when we ask this how question too soon, part of the problem then becomes getting my cursor. We see this urge to duplicate what has already been accomplished, and it really creates this cycle of imitation that really may not meet the needs of your community at all. If something doesn't work well somewhere else, then the school can pounce on that and say, well, it didn't work over there. I don't think it's going to work here either. So the question, how are others doing it successfully, becomes, how do we create it together? Because we do have the knowledge and the skills. And the challenge is for us to put faith in ourselves and to act on it. So yes, there may be this model school someplace, and it's like, look, the kids, hey, they stand in a straight line, they have quiet hands, they're looking at the teacher and making eye contact. We might have some diversity in here, and they're all included, but this model school may not be the model that you and your community doesn't want, right? So instead, we want to look at that collaboration. And we don't want just adults at the table. We need students at the same table. And it's not like, oh, we'll go gather the students' opinion and bring it back. It's like, no, we go gather the students and we bring the students to the table. And with the adults, with the students, we look at what we can create together. Because we're going to question the questions. And when we ask how too soon, we're looking for the recipe or the step-by-step guide. Instead, we must ask what matters most, and that's what we pursue. So sorry for our abrupt ending there when my computer battery went out. So this is kind of an anticlimactic end, right? But keep your comments, keep your questions coming. Again, I'll be sending out show notes about this if you don't, if you currently aren't on my email list and you would like to start receiving the weekly emails, let me know. And Mindy has a great thought for us to end on. She says, there has to be a piece of it that is how your child feels. Do they feel they belong? Yeah, and that's the part that's hard, right? To be able to, measure that, to be able to bring that out. And that's where the conversations, I think, are the important parts of how we need to know, the feelings, the reactions that our students have every day. So I encourage you, if you like to read, to check out Peter Block's book, The Answer to How is Yes, Acting on What Matters. We will be back next Thursday here, and let's keep having these kinds of discussions going, and we will continue making progress and making change for our kids. So thank you for being with us, and we shall see you next week. And we'll do our little